See them hype with money and clothes and car. Some a run down fame, enough of them a just wanna be star. Nah grudge them cause me have my life. And me say health and strength over everything.
So it's 11:32. We're going to get started with the second session of our teach-in. We had a great first session this morning. For those of you who were there, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are joining us now, thank you so much for joining us now. We're super excited. We started this morning with the past. We're moving into the present. I'm Sam Rosaldo. I work in District 79, but I'm here because I'm passionate about school integration. I want to first just say thank you to Bureaucrats for Black Lives, the Auspice of Student Enrollment, OSE Kinfolk, Division of Early Childhood Education, DECE Anti-Racist Coalition, who all helped to put this on. This was very much a collective effort. I also want to shout out my colleagues. We're going to do super brief introductions because some of us already introduced ourselves in the first session, but we also have some new folks coming on. So let me start with introduce yourselves. Andy, take it away. Tell us who you are.
Hi, thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Andy McClintock. I am the Senior Director of Equity Planning and Implementation with the Department of Education. I work with the Office of Student Enrollment. I am very lucky because I get to work directly on school integration for the DOE at the school, district, and city level. I first began supporting this work in District 15 with the District 15 Diversity Plan alongside Sadie and all of the wonderful leaders in the district. I'm white. And I never spoke about race growing up. My work in District 15 made me want to be anti-racist, but it also helped me to realize that you can't, as an individual, you can't be anti-racist without acknowledging race and racism. And I think that the same thing is true for institutions. I'm here because it's my belief that an institution like the DOE cannot be anti-racist without acknowledging race and racism, both past and present. And it's my hope that this teaching can be part of our building that institutional awareness together.
Sadie, tell us real brief, who are you? Why are you here?
I'm here to raise hell in service of an anti-racist Department of Education. I was born in El Salvador. I'm a proud immigrant to New York City. I was raised by a single mama in downtown Manhattan. I'm a public school graduate in the city. I'm a public school parent right now. I'm a proud anti-racist who's always looking to flex that muscle and to deepen it in community with y'all. I am a learner. I am a non-Black, but a pro-Black community organizer. I do this work for my mama. I do this work for my son. I do this work to heal. And I am so excited to be with y'all today.
Thank you. Jordan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Belton. I work for the Office of Student Enrollment. I was originally born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I actually grew up a few blocks away from where George Floyd was killed. I'm a proud public school graduate, but I also went to those schools that were diverse on paper, but very segregated inside the school itself. And I just come from a long line of freedom fighters and anti-racist, and I'm here to continue that legacy.
Cool, thank you. And again, I'm Sam Rosaldo, and I'm here just because I believe that there's no path to educational equity, which is ostensibly what all of us employees of the DOE are working towards, if we don't address school segregation. So I want to make it clear that all of us who are presenting are employees, central employees of the DOE, but we're doing this voluntarily. No one asked us to do this. We found each other and decided to do it. The first time we did this just for an internal audience of DOE central employees, and we wanted to do it again. And this time we opened it up, and it just so happened that we did it on the same day that a major announcement was made about screens for the coming year. I don't even want to say announcement was made about integration or segregation, though if you read the New York Times headline, you would think that it has been. If you're watching Twitter, I'm seeing mayoral candidates weighing in. I'm seeing the Teen State Charge voicing their dissatisfaction. I'm seeing other people saying, hey, you know what, this is actually the most substantive step forward this administration has made, even if they were forced into it. So we're still processing what it means. And we're not really going to discuss today's decision in depth, but it's hugely relevant because the decision, there's a very clear decision, which is they said no middle school screens for the coming year, and high school screens are being, I guess for some schools they have options in terms of whether they're going to use them or not. So there's going to be some variance in terms of how high school screens are administered. We did not hear anything about gifted and talented, so stay tuned on that. And I just want to ask, before we jump into the presentation, if there's anything else to add, just to contextualize where we are and how this is relating. You know, we're not here for the hot take, but we do want to just be transparent and say, like, something happened this morning and it's hugely relevant to this presentation right now. So Sadie, do you want to give any reaction at this point?
I guess, you know, I'm sitting in the place of multiple truths where two things can be true at the same time. Two opposing things can seemingly be true at the same time. And so on the one hand, when I hear people say the removal of middle school screens today and that decision was on the backs of the advocacy of students and parents and educators, well, that's totally true, right? And activists and advocates like ourselves, internally and externally. And I don't think we should let any moment ever, especially as a community organizer, pass us where we say, wow, we did a lot of work. We lifted this conversation. We brought it to the halls of City Hall. The mayor listened. And the other opposing truth or other truth I'm holding is it was for 1 year. It took a global pandemic. Our chancellor has been questioning the premise of middle school screens before pandemic. And so that's what I'm sitting with, the gratitude and the sort of pragmatic reality of what brought us here. So thank you for the opportunity to reflect. Andy?
Yeah, I think I share in a lot of the same insights that you just shared. I mean, it feels like it's not wrong, but I'm not sure that it's fully right either. You know, I think that as we'll see, and a little later in this presentation, I'm going to share with all of you some data on the impacts that screens have or has on our students in our schools. And you know, it's clear to me that screening drives segregation. But I also don't think that the removal or the pause of screening will cause integration. So I think that there's a long, you know, I'm on the one hand, I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think that there's a lot more work that we need to do.
Yeah, I said we weren't here for the hot take, but that sounds like a hot take, Andy. Thank you. Jordan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to add that I agree with Andy that this is a step in the right direction. But for those of us that attended the earlier session, we know that a step in the right direction can be met with a step backwards.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, hot
So
fire.
we need to keep our foot on the gas. We need to continue to push, and we need to continue to talk and be in community with one another, which is what we're doing now.
Yeah. So my role was just to introduce things, and I'm handing it over to Sadie and Andy, and later on, Jordan's gonna help kind of take my role as we're closing out. So I will turn off my screen and look forward to this presentation. Sadie and Andy, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna take us to the present, right? We just heard about the past, and the year was 2014. And I think we have a slide for this, so I wanna just give us a moment to bring that up. Thank you, welcome to the present. I'm going to now try to get out of this here full screen and go to my notes. Thank you all. The year was 2014, and Bill de Blasio was just elected the mayor of New York City. I joined the Department of Education on the heels of working inauguration. I was working for Bill de Blasio since 2009 on education organizing. And in June 2013, as he was running for mayor, became his, what we call a body woman, a person that travels with him day in, day out, manages his moment to moment. And so I worked inauguration, and then I joined the new chancellor, Chancellor Fariña's team in January 6th, 2014 as her special assistant as well, right? We always want to root in the personal experience. That was also the same year that the UCLA Civil Rights Project came out with a report that said that New York City was the third most segregated city in the nation, second to Chicago being number one and Dallas being number two. It also said that New York State was the most segregated state in the nation. But at the time, even when that came out, we as an administration were not able to comfortably use the words segregation, desegregation, integration, anti-racism. And I say that because I did often and still do a lot of public speaking on behalf of the agency, and simply was advised, don't use those terms, right? And I'd love to hear you sound off in chat why you think we were not allowed to use those terms, right? The terms we were encouraged to use were diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Those are safer words. And as I have deepened my own practice in racial equity and anti-racism, I've noticed even in myself that I was managing racism as opposed to being in service of eliminating it. And using those words sometimes is like a nicer, gentler way to approach racism, which is neither nice nor gentle. There were pockets of the city also at 2014 at that time calling for more diversity, asking, hey, this is not why I moved to the city. Like, my school feels really segregated. Can we have more diversity? And the term, as I keep saying, was more diversity. Now, you should know, I went to public schools in New York City, in Greenwich Village, and Chelsea my whole life. And I was often one of very few people of color in my classes my entire career. I never learned about El Salvador, which is where I was born. I never had a teacher that looked like me. And so when I heard this, again, rooting from the personal, I was triggered, like, diversity on whose terms, right? Was it Upper West Side white parents? Was it affluent parents who were in the gentrifying Lower East Side? Was it Park Slope families who also were mostly white? I don't mean to say that the people that cared about integration or these matters were only white. I just want to lift up that at the time in the Department of Education, the advocacy we were hearing from were these specific pockets. Our reaction at the time from the mayor and the chancellor was, this is a housing issue, we can't take care of this. This is a decades old issue, we're not going to be able to fix it. Or quite honestly, most parents want to send their kid down the block to a safe and quality public school. And that tension was at odds with also integrating our city. I was cautious entering these conversations, again, based on my own personal trauma, based on the fact that it was a difficult conversation to weigh into, right? And again, you can sound off in chat and I'll be able to look at it in a little bit. We're like, why do you think that it was so difficult for the mayor and the chancellor in 2014 to even say our schools were segregated? The tension kept growing, and a group of principals came together and asked to meet with the chancellor and said, hey, we either want to maintain our diverse learning environments, maybe due to gentrification or other changing areas, zone lines, etc., or we want to establish and promote more diversity. This is why I got involved in the work. This is why I want to teach, or I want to lead a school in New York City, right? These became the first class of the diversity and admissions principles. We started with about 6, it grew to 12, 14, and today we have nearly 200 schools across the city that have some sort of what we call DIA, which is Diversity in Admissions Program. And they vary, and I'm not gonna get too into the details of them, but basically it's how do we play with admissions priorities to ensure demographic diversity. In 2017, now we're skipping 3 years because it took until 2017 for the New York City Department of Education to release what I call a white paper, and it was called the Diversity Plan. And it outlined some goals, it outlined some things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all of them today, but what I am going to say is that it was June 6th, 2017, when we said a couple of very important things. Three I'm going to lift up for you today. The first is that diversity adds value to our classroom and that we believe that all students benefit from diverse classroom settings. All of us maybe on this call might be like, duh. At the same time, we are the largest municipality in the nation, right? We're huge, we're massive. And the fact that we led with that value statement was something that we hadn't done in the past. And so that's an important thing to note. The other two things that we laid out there were we wanted to tackle diversity or work with communities to develop community-driven diversity plans on a citywide level. And so we established the School Diversity Advisory Group. Talk about that in a moment. And the third thing we did is we would partner with districts across the city to develop, again, community-driven plans that would result in a diversity plan to advance school diversity and integration efforts. At that time, 2017, we were still not using the term integration or desegregation very boldly. We did, however, list out what diversity meant to the DOE, and it's a long list, but I'll lift up a few just to ground us in what we meant, because language really matters. Racial background, socioeconomic status, home language, immigration status, ability, gender identity, religion, housing status, and life experience, right? So, and it's longer than that, but that's just a few. That's to give you a sense of where we're coming from. Now, because we know that history repeats itself, this citywide effort looked a lot like the 1954 effort that was created called the Intergroup Committee on New York Public Schools. That was a big group of people with parents, with activists, with civil rights groups like the NAACP, students, etc. And that looked a lot like the School Diversity Advisory Group. Sound off on chat if you know or have heard about the School Diversity Advisory Group. Maybe some of you were even a part of it. Maybe some of you joined one of our town halls that we led across the city. So give us a little what's up. Oh yeah, I heard about it. Nah, what's that? What is SDAG? And SDAG is our kind of ugly acronym for the School Diversity Advisory Group. That was a 40-person group comprised of students, parents, educators, advocates, teachers, as well as central staff. And myself and other colleagues on the call also supported those meetings, every single meeting, and of course, maintain a lot of relationships with the leaders that sat on there, some of whom you'll be hearing from later today, including Nadia Chada and Matt Gonzalez. The School Diversity Advisory Group released 2 reports. The first, that was largely approved by the mayor and chancellor, outlined the framework for integration, which was the 5 R's. I went through the 5 R's in the first, but I'm going to go through it again. I think we have a little slide just so that we can have a little visual reference. 5 R's of integration. We have race and enrollment. Maybe we don't have it, that's fine. We have race and enrollment, which talks about student demographics, resources, which talks about all of the different expansive ways that schools are resourced beyond just cold hard cash that we give them, but PTAs, etc. Representation, which talks about teacher diversity and staff diversity, who is serving the lunch, what kind of messages does it serve to look at teacher leaders versus who are our school safety agents. And again, messages that it sends to us as adults and as students. Restorative justice, which is lifts up the point that we can't just have diverse schools without directly interrogating how we discipline students. What is the other one? Restorative justice. This is why I have the slide. Restorative practices, representation, resources, race and enrollment, and real relationships, of course. And that really speaks to the fact that we are really all on the front lines of cultivating our own real relationships, of our own justice practices, our own democracy, and that we can't just sort of shake demographics up and hope for the best, but it takes ongoing and intentional work to cultivate those relationships with one another. And second, of course, the second report focused on admissions changes, and that we had not responded to still to date, although we did make an admissions announcement today that we'll talk about in just one brief moment. The other thing was we began our district integration planning in the Community School District 15, which could become its own whole presentation, but that was a year-long community engagement process that ran from 2017 to 2018 that sought to solve for 11 segregated middle schools in that district. That work was anchored by a 16-member dual language working group, and it was comprised of students, parents, teachers, local advocates, and central DOE staffers who project managed and also helped architect that work. And those two people were myself and my colleague, Andy, who you're gonna hear from today. So I'm gonna just bring us to, quick note, the Chancellor Carranza actually joined the DOE in 2018, and we were in the middle of those processes, and a lot of language opened up for us because he came in sort of unapologetically naming that, look, I did this listening tour, students are telling me the schools are segregated, I'm a brown man, I have a role in this, let's advance equity for our students. And that, again, speaking from myself, opened up a whole window to show up very differently publicly, more like what you're seeing today. It was able to bring that vulnerability, bring the like, this has been really hard, this is really difficult, but that in no way we should be apologetic about trying to create a more anti-racist world, right? That certain students are being privileged and families are being privileged as a result of systemic policies, and we need to do work to dismantle that. So he paved a big way for us. He even paved a way for us DOE employees to lead a teach-in like this. So we have to give credit where credit is due. But now it's 2020, and all of us are sitting behind our beloved computers in the throes of two pandemics. The first, of course, is the health pandemic, where many of us have experienced personal loss, and we continue to lose souls across the nation. And so we can't sort of acknowledge the present without really centering those who we have lost. And really hoping for a better tomorrow, certainly for our students and our families. But it's been very difficult and very trying. The other thing that is going on is, of course, the racial uprisings that have, again, sort of brought to surface a lot of the things that we already know to have been true, which is racism has run rampant. And what are the things that we can do today to dismantle some of the policies that the Department of Education holds up that privilege some students over others. And so, saying all that to say, there are a couple different inputs that we are working towards deepening our integration and diversity efforts across the city. On the school level, we have diversity at admissions, right? Where principals and school communities who want to remove gifted and talented, or want to remove screens, or want to do a different priority or different admissions process can do that. At the city level, we just announced today the removal of middle school screens for 1 year due to the lack of data due to coronavirus and the lack of data, but also knowing that the chancellor has said that this is a questionable practice regardless. We will remove geographic priority for high schools. That impacts about 200 high schools that have some sort of geographic priority, whether it's a zone, a district, or a borough. 48 of those schools will be impacted for this admission cycle coming up for September. And then the others will be sort of rolling as the next year happens. And so that's something that we've also announced an expansion of district integration planning. We did do integration planning in District 15, a little bit in District 1 and 3, but are currently in paused processes in Districts 9, 13, 16, 28, and 31. I'm sure somebody can put all those districts in chat. If not, I will in a moment, because I know that's a lot of numbers. And I'm also speaking, assuming that you know what I mean by those districts. And so I apologize if I should go back, but time is of the essence. And then last but not least, New York State awarded 6 districts this fall, $2.5 million approximately each district over a course of 3 years to implement integration planning and integration planning processes, right? And I guess I would offer that we believe implement means community engagement and developing equitable community-driven solutions. And those are SIP districts. So SIP stands for State Integration Program. And that's in District 2, Districts 3, 13, 15, 24, and 30. And again, I'll put that in chat. So I guess what I wanted you to take away is two things. One, that there's a lot of work happening in the city, so a lot of ripe opportunity to dig in and to really center what does anti-racist practice look like as we drive towards integration and like the real 5R holistic version of it. And then also offer that enrollment is a lever of change. It is not the only form of change, but they are important levers, no less. And so with that, I wanted to hand it over to my colleague, Andy, who will talk about two particular admissions policies today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sadie. So the presentation that I'm going to share with all of you today was actually commissioned by the School Diversity Advisory Group that Sadie spoke about just a moment ago. And they asked for a presentation to show data on schools that use selective admissions. Now, before we talk about those schools and their admissions practices, let's just talk very quickly about how admissions works generally in New York City. So in New York City, families apply to the schools that they would like to attend. We have separate application processes for pre-K, both for 3- and 4-year-olds, for kindergarten, for 6th grade, which is what we call middle school admissions, and for 9th grade, which we call high school admissions. At many schools, there are more families applying than there are available seats. And so we need some way to figure out which students can get offers to which schools. Now, schools do this in different ways. Many schools have what are called priorities to determine who gets in first. A common example of this would be for elementary school. Many elementary schools give priority to students who live within a specific geographic zone around the school. Once all of these priorities are accounted for, many schools use a random number generated from a computer to decide who gets an offer. But some schools use what are called selective admissions, which basically means that they're able to see some type of academic information about their applicants, and they're able to select students based upon that information. Now, we're going to look at two different types of selective admissions today. We're going to look at the gifted and talented admissions and the associated programs, and we're going to look at something called screens and screen schools. Now, when we say gifted and talented, the citywide gifted and talented programs refer exclusively to elementary schools. So when we say G&T, we're talking about elementary school. Screens refers to an admissions practice for middle and high schools. So when we're talking about screening, we're only talking about middle and high school. So we're going to talk about those separately today. And we are going to start by talking about gifted and talented, or G&T. So what is gifted and talented? Well, speaking broadly, gifted and talented education is a concept. It refers to this idea of supports for so-called gifted students who may require some form of specialized instruction. In New York City, when folks say gifted and talented, they're not referring to a concept, they're referring to a set of programs. Now, there's no standardized curriculum in these programs, in our gifted and talented programs. In fact, there's nothing to prevent a regular elementary school from adopting some or all of the pedagogical practices that these G&T programs use. The only thing that sets these programs apart from our regular elementary schools is the way students are admitted to them. And they are admitted based on the result of a single multiple choice test. Now, students can apply to these programs as rising kindergartners. So for kindergarten, for 1st grade, for 2nd grade, and for 3rd grade. But the majority of seats go to kindergartners, and there are fewer and fewer seats available in each successive grade every year. And that makes sense because most kiddos get in as kindergartners and then they stay in that program throughout all of elementary school. So because the majority of these seats are going to kindergartners, for this presentation, we're only going to look at what this process looks like for kindergartners. This is the G&T pipeline, and it basically explains all of the steps that a family would have to go through if they wanted their child to enroll in a G&T program. So all the way to the left, we have all of the kindergartners in the city. And those are all of the potential pool of students that could ultimately enroll in one of these programs. If a family is interested in having their child attend one of these programs, they have to request to take the G&T test. So they actually have to fill out a special form to register to take this test. At that point, their child has to go and take the test. If they're in one of our pre-K programs, they can be tested at their school. If they're not, they can come to a special testing site to receive this test. Now, only some students who take this test qualify. It's the top 10% of all students nationally. So any student that's in the 90th percentile or above on this test qualifies for our G&T programs. But qualifying does not automatically put you in one of these programs. Families still need to apply. They need to fill out an application, and that is a separate application from the regular kindergarten application that our families fill out. Last, not every student who applies to a specific G&T program is able to get an offer at that program, or potentially to a G&T program at all. And so as you can see, at each stage in this pipeline, there are barriers for families. Now, before we even get into any of the barriers that are listed here, let's remind ourselves that we are dealing with 4-year-olds. If you have not seen a 4-year-old in a while, they are fantastic. They have a number of amazing skills, but some things they are not able to do are fill out forms, contact test prep companies, research school options, etc. And so said another way, the kindergartners, the rising kindergartners, are wholly reliant on the adults around them to gain access to these programs. The first major barrier that any family faces is the test itself. We do not have universal testing. And so what that means is that the adults in the lives of these kiddos need to have an awareness of these programs in order to request to take a test and to begin to usher their child through this pipeline. There are many potential barriers there, ranging from the amount of time a parent can spend working on their child's admissions to language and things like literacy. And we also know that word of mouth is a really huge factor in how this information gets distributed. And that often happens in informal networks that not all parents have access to. Next, there are barriers to qualifying. Students are identified as gifted based on the result of a single multiple choice test. Now, using a single assessment to identify giftedness in students is questionable at best, especially for 4-year-olds. In fact, the National Association for Gifted Children urges programs to use more than one assessment that vary informal. A good non-example of this would be New York City's single all multiple choice test. Now, lastly, even if a student takes the test, qualifies, applies, there is a chance that they don't get a seat. There's limited availability, particularly in some neighborhoods, as we'll see shortly, and some students have priority over others. So it's important to note that as we move through this pipeline, we're seeing fewer and fewer students at each step along the way. But what we'll see in just a second is that the characteristics of students at each point in this pipeline also look different. Now here at the top, you see that same pipeline. But what we're looking at is demographic information about all of the students who are at a given point in the pipeline. And the demographic information that we're looking at here, it's 4 racial and ethnic categories. Now, these are, of course, very crude. There are many more identities than this and many intersections between these identities. But because of the way we collect data and for the purpose of this presentation, we're just looking at these 4 groups. And those groups are Latinx, Black, Asian, and white. Now, I actually think that it's easiest to see what's happening here by focusing on each group one at a time. So we're going to start by looking at Latinx students. So Latinx students make up the largest share of kindergartners at 41%. They make up only 20% of testers, 10% of qualifiers, 10% of applicants, and 10% of students who receive offers to these programs. Black students make up 24% of kindergartners in the city. They make up 17% of testers, 7% of qualifiers, 7% of applicants, and 8% of offers. Now, when we look at students who identify as Asian, we see a different trend. They make up 18% of the kindergartners in the city, but they make up 32% of testers, 40% of qualifiers, 42% of applicants, and 42% of students who receive an offer to one of these programs. White students, who make up the smallest fraction of kindergartners in the city, make up the largest fraction of testers and qualifiers at 32% of testers, 43% of qualifiers. They make up 41% of applicants and 39% of students that receive an offer to one of these programs. Now, this is that same data, but shown a little bit of a different way. And to kind of sum it up, we see that Black and Latinx students, shown here in yellow and pink, make up about 2/3 of the kindergartners in the city. They make up about 1/3 of the students that take the G&T test, and they make up only about 1/6 of the students that ultimately qualify. Here we're going to take a look at the geographic distribution of these programs across New York City. So this here is New York City. When this presentation was made for the School Diversity Advisory Group, there were 81 kindergarten G&T programs. Right now we have 80 kindergarten G&T programs in New York City. And these white triangles show the distribution of those programs across the city. Now we're going to overlay some demographic data. And what these colors show, actually, if we zoom in, these colors are actually thousands and thousands of individual colored dots. And those dots are colored according to those same racial and ethnic categories that we were looking at before. And the location of the dots are based on where students live in New York City. So what we see is that kindergarten G&T programs are not distributed evenly across the city. We have heard from families, from advocates, from elected officials, a desire for more and closer G&T programs in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and brown. In fact, many families choose not to take the G&T test because there is no convenient program near their home. Ironically, and somewhat disappointingly, the DOE evaluates the placement of G&T programs in part based on the number of testers and qualifiers in a given neighborhood. So we have families who are not taking the G&T test because there is no program nearby. And then the DOE is justifying there not being a program in that neighborhood because there aren't enough people who are taking the test and qualifying. Now, the last thing that I'd like to talk about for gifted and talented admissions is their priority structure, specifically for district programs. So in principle, for G&T, students are admitted based on score order. So the 99s get in before the 98s get in before the 97s, et cetera. In practice, there are actually a number of priority groups that determine first who gets in, and then score order happens within those priority groups. And so there are two major types of priorities. There is a sibling priority, meaning you have a sibling that is already attending the school. And then there's a district priority, meaning that you live in the district where that program is. And so when you combine these things together, you get these four priority groups. You have siblings that are living in the district, siblings that live outside the district, everybody else that lives in the district, and everybody else that lives outside the district. Now, what these priority groups mean is that you could score a 99, which is the highest possible score that you can get on the G&T test. But if you don't have a sibling and if you don't live in that district, any other qualifier who gets a 90 or above, who's in priority groups 1, 2, or 3, is going to get in ahead of you regardless of the score that they get. So what's the impact that this causes? Well, the district priority means that families who live in a district that has more G&T programs naturally have access to more G&T seats. The sibling piece of this creates this kind of family legacy structure, which I think kind of obviously hinders diversification, but it also sort of undermines this concept that the admissions to gifted and talented is purely based on this idea of ability grouping, putting students all together based on their ability. We've talked a lot about gifted and talented, and we're going to move on to talk about screens.
And you should move on, but I just want to the Q&A part, want to encourage folks, if you have questions about gifted and talented. Andy can't see the chat because he's screen sharing, I think, at the same time. So just keep those questions. We will come back to them, but we are going to now shift into a different. So thank you so much. And your participation has been off the hook, y'all. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Sadie. So we're shifting to talk about screens. And so again, we've left elementary school behind. We're now talking only about middle and high school. Okay, so what is a screen? In essence, a screen means that a screen school is able to pick the students that they would like to attend their school. What it actually means is that they're able to see all of their applicants and a ton of academic information about their applicants, and they're able to rank in a specific order which students they would like admitted to their school in what order. Schools have an incredible amount of leeway in terms of what metrics they can use. And remember, this presentation is present, but this is sort of the recent past. Based on our announcement today, and because of COVID, some of these are not available. But take us back a couple of years, and schools have a large number of metrics that they're able to use in order to rank students. They can look at students' state test scores. They can look at students' elementary school behavior grades in the case of middle school admissions. They can look at students' course grades. They can look at their attendance and punctuality. Schools can have interviews. They can host auditions. They can create their own school-based assessments, or they can ask that a student or their family demonstrate interest in the school in some way. And so that might be like attending an open house. What is the impact of having these selection criteria or these screens? So what we're looking at right here is we're looking at a sort of group of data on applicants to middle school. This is middle school data. And this is actually data on all of our middle schoolers, but if it's helpful, it can be helpful sometimes to imagine that this is just what's happening at one school. So at the top, we have all applicants. And again, we have this data broken out by those same racial and ethnic categories. And the idea is that these may be different numbers of students applying to a school. So a school might have a different number of Asian and white and Black and Latinx applicants, but to start, that those whole circles at the top represent all of those students. Every single applicant starts off in this pool. We're going to take a look at what happens when we apply a specific type of screen. And this is just an example, but the screen that we're looking at here is applicants that have fewer than 5 absences and fewer than 5 tardies. Now, realistically, a screen school would probably have a much more complicated rubric that would have this and a number of other screens all built in together. But just for this example, we're just looking at applicants that have fewer than 5 absences and fewer than 5 tardies. And what we notice when we take a look at that, this second row down here, is that it has a differential impact based on student characteristic. So 61% of all of the Asian students who applied for middle school meet this screen. 37% of white students who apply to middle school meet this screen. 25% of Black students who apply to middle school meet this screen. And 25% of Latinx students who apply to middle school meet this screen. So what you see is that there's a differential impact here. Now, what is the result from these differential impacts? The result is that the demographics of screen schools look different than the demographics of not screen schools. So here we have 3 broad categories of schools. At the top, we have schools that do not use screens. In the middle, we have all screen schools. At the bottom, we have only the most highly selective screen schools. And so for this presentation, that means schools that have an average incoming test score of 3.5 or higher on state exams. So what we can see is that the demographics shown here to the left of these schools are different. Schools that are not screened are predominantly Black and Latinx, 49% Latinx, 34% Black, only 8% Asian, and 7% white. When we look at all screen schools, we see that they become less Black, less Latinx, more white, and more Asian. So it's 36% Latinx, 23% Black, 18% white, and 18% Asian. Moving down to the most highly selective screen schools, so these are a subset of those schools above them, we see that that trend continues. They become even more white and Asian, overrepresenting highly white and Asian students and underrepresenting highly Black and Latinx students. So these schools are 37% Asian, 34% white, 15% Latinx, and 8% Black. Now this concept that we see different demographics of students at different types of schools is true not just for racial and ethnic categories, but for other student characteristics as well. So here we have those same three categories of schools. We've got not screened, all screened, and then that subset, the most highly selective screen schools. And we have three different categories of student characteristics. So on the left, we have students with disabilities, SWD. In the center, we have emergent multilingual learners, that's EMLL. And on the right, we have students whose family's income qualifies them federally for free and reduced price lunch, which is abbreviated FRL. What you can see is that the percentages of students who have these characteristics are very different in these three types of schools. In fact, to the extent that any of these characteristics can be described as a vulnerability for students, we see fewer and fewer vulnerable students as schools become more and more academically selective. Now, you know, this presentation is coming on the heels of a fairly sizable announcement about some pretty significant changes to screened admissions at the very least. As Sam mentioned, we have yet to hear any updates about what is happening with our gifted and talented admissions. You know, I shared a little bit about how, you know, earlier about my initial reflections on this announcement. I think, you know, I think very much that meaningful integration will be achieved not by removing or pausing, but by adding and reimagining and sort of pouring into our system, really thinking about what we would like, what an equitable anti-racist school system could possibly look like. This presentation is sort of focused on the present, and so I'm really, really excited for our future-focused panel, which is coming a little later this afternoon, who will be able to share with us a little bit about what they would like to see in our future. And so with that, I am going to pass the mic to my wonderful colleague, Jordan Belton, who is going to lead us in some reflections and close us out.
Thank you, Andy. And Sadie for the in-depth information and context. As we transition to Q&A, let's just take stock really quickly of the session as a whole. In general, the session shed light on some of the impacts of New York City screens, who and what areas are left out by nature of the screens themselves, and how they contribute to segregation. But what does all this mean? What does it say about our system? How does it relate to your sphere of influence? What can you do? That's what these two questions are getting at. So please share your thoughts in the chat and just let us know your thoughts on how the data is impacting you and what you think it says, and yeah, again, what you feel your role is. How can you create change?
I see two things in the chat that I wanted to respond to. One is a couple people have, and these are related, a couple of people have asked, how can we get a version of these presentations at our schools? And Francis put the email for Bureaucrats for Black Lives in the chat. Francis, if you could drop that in there again. I think it's NYC DOE BLM for Black Lives Matter at Gmail.
At gmail.com.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So hit us up. We'd love to arrange something. We want to support folks. And Deb asked, like, how much advocacy, how much pressure are policymakers feeling to actually do something about G&T? And so I just wanted to ask, I want to say two things. One is there is a school by school approach, right? Which the more school, you can do it individually at a school, and the more schools that do that, the more pressure that will be felt at the top. And then there's also the notion that a top-down policy measure can be taken. And there needs to be pressure at both places for policy changes to be made. But I wanted to ask Andy and Sadie if you could say a word about the SDAG, the School Diversity Advisory Group's recommendation around gifted and talented, and where that landed. And that's building off of Deb's question in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, so the School Diversity Advisory Group issued a set of recommendations in their second report, and it was called Making the Grade 2, and it was really focused on admissions. The sort of gifted and talented component of that is that they recommended that the Department of Education break away from this concept of using a single multiple choice test to admit students to these separate gifted and talented programs, and that schools explore new ways of enrichment and support for gifted students. Ideally, creating even greater access to these enrichments and these programs across the city. I will say that the headline that sort of came out was like, School Diversity Advisory Group says like scrap gifted and talented. And my reaction to that, one of the challenges that we face is, and I mentioned this in the presentation, there's a very big difference between the concept of gifted and talented education and our implementation of gifted and talented programs. Those things are very separate from one another. There are many, many schools across New York City that are right now doing phenomenal things to support gifted students inside their classrooms, and they are not G&T programs. A school can have a teacher who is certified to teach gifted and talented and employ that teacher and have that teacher providing supports for students in that school without using a test to admit students to that school. And so, the Department of Education has not kind of officially adopted or rejected any of the School Diversity Advisory Group's second set of recommendations. We've yet to hear what is happening with G&T because of COVID. I just like my sort of 2 cents and my first reaction is there are ways that we can explore different implementations of this that are not entirely eliminating the concept of gifted and talented education. I hope I answered. I hope I answered.
And I think that's what the SDAG sought to articulate, that they wanted an expansion of school enrichment programs. And so just to be clear to this whole group, school enrichment program sounds broad because it is broad. So that can mean a teacher does differentiated instruction for their more accelerated learners and learners that are still struggling. And by the way, every single one of us learns differently. And so differentiation is a core competency and is what's revered and reflected in what we deem as master teachers. So I think there's that piece. There's also school enrichment could be after school programs. It could be additional course work. It could be field trips, access to other types of programming, music and arts. And so I think the opportunity in the recommendation and that we have, especially because COVID has sort of had to focus us on what's the possibility for, what could the future of gifted and talented be? On the one hand, I would say school enrichment models should be used across the board, but that those could be powerful community conversations. And then the other thing is that to all of our points, gifted and talented, the way we administer it as a test is not a curriculum. It is not a gifted and talented program and we talked about PS9, whose families came together to remove it. They said, and again, this is just top line, families said, we can't tell the difference between those classes in that the teaching, the expectations, the focus of the kids is the same. The only thing we can tell that is the difference is the racial segregation. And that did harm. Right, that their school is so beautifully diverse when you look at dismissal and you look at when people are dropping off their kids, but that when you saw the holiday spectacular, it was a holiday nightmare because it was like the gen ed class looked away and the gifted class looked another way. And again, we haven't normalized what curriculum is or the expectations. And so I think what we're offering is let us deepen the conversation to talk about what school-wide enrichment is, lift up that teachers' core competency is already differentiation. So we need to always, if they're accelerated learners, make sure that they're getting challenged, that their expectations are rising to their occasion. And so SDAG actually, despite the New York Times headline that said SDAG asked to eliminate gifted and talented, it didn't. It asked us to do a deeper dive into what school-wide enrichment models look like so that we could reach our most accelerated learners and our differentiated learners. The other thing I'll offer is that presently, it's no surprise that coronavirus has put our system in a way where we're struggling for staff. Some schools have 40% less staff due to medical accommodations or other issues. And so students and classes have already been integrated, right? Especially hearing anecdotes out of parts in Queens, where, spoiler alert, everybody's actually doing great in an integrated classroom setting, and that students are okay and that parents are okay too. And so I want us to, as we are critically thinking about all of it, like what is the attachment that we as a city have developed to this like label of gifted and talented, and dig a little deeper and say, what really are the expectations that we want for our kids? And again, that is what the SDAG 2 recommendation offers us, invites us to do. And that's not going to take one or two people, it's going to take all of us. So I appreciate the question, Sam.
Yeah, we're at about 12:28 right now. So in closing, I just wanted to state just a couple remarks. What I wanted to acknowledge really is that even though our system is adopting temporary policy changes to admissions policies, these changes are temporary and incomplete, as has been said in this session. History also tells us that these policies will probably face backlash. The policy changes that were enacted today will, may face backlash and can be reversed in the future. So if we want them to be maintained, and if we want a more integrated future, we have to keep our foot on the gas. And how do we do that? There are lots of things that need to happen to do that, but one of them is just staying energized and sharing information. So we invite you to talk about and share the information you've learned here today. And with that said, we want to thank you all for being here. And we will see you in about 30 minutes at 1 p.m. for a panel discussion with some really incredible advocates and with a representative from the Office of Student Enrollment and the DOE. So we will see you all shortly, and thank you so much for being here.